hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, hey yo. Cross Beats Production.
Welcome back to Crossbeats Production here with Nate28, and this is a tutorial about when to use a limiter versus a compressor. So basically it's kind of going to be a short tutorial. I don't want to go into too much depth on it, but I want to show you guys when I decide to do that and how I approach limiting versus compressing, and when I find it most appropriate. Somebody asked me in my comments about using a limiter in Maschine, and when to use it, and when to use it on groups, when to use it on tracks, etc. So I decided to create some sort of a diagram or show diagrams that I found off the internet to explain my reasoning behind using a limiter versus a compressor. So it's pretty simple for me it's pretty simple to decide when I want to use a limiter versus a compressor, and generally the way I approach that is by using this idea here. So this idea first here is a compressed signal versus uncompressed signal, and it shows you the difference in the dynamic range. So what the dynamic range is, if you don't understand what I'm talking about, is basically this loudest part here to this quietest part here. So that's the dynamic range within the signal. So if you're looking at a instrument, for example piano, or a vocal or something of that nature, usually those types of instruments have a lot of dynamic range, and if you have issues with dynamic range within your mix, usually the issues you face is having instruments just poke out of the mix out of nowhere and having problems with them trying to blend in and feel cohesive within the mix. So usually a compressor is a good way to make things like that come together and, you know, bring them together, like you can see in this diagram here below, a compressor signal, to kind of make them sound more even together and bring them closer together to each other. The issue that you might face though if you're using compressor sometimes with, for example, drums or other things like that, is the manipulation of the envelope. So when I'm talking about the manipulation of the envelope, just to describe that, basically it's this section here. So say for example, actually what I'll do, I'll show you this diagram here. So this diagram here is pretty much, if you could imagine that being a kick or an 808, this thing here, the envelope is basically the stretching out part of this, so the sustain and the transient, so the original transient and the sustain. So the way that a compressor usually works is it has an attack, whatever that attack might be. Say it could be 50 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, 2 milliseconds, whatever it is. That attack is what is the first initial part of that compressor working on the signal. So usually a compressor is automatically working on the signal all the time, but you're pulling a threshold down, so you're telling the compressor to work at a certain level. So this is the threshold here, so you're pulling that down. It's getting a certain level of audio at that level, and it's trying to bring it down to the other level of the audio. Then what you would normally do is create a makeup gain, which brings the other part of the audio kind of similar to the closest of the level of the audio that you brought down. So how do I decide if I'm going to use a compressor or a limiter on my kick, my snare, or whatever it is? Usually I don't normally put limiters on individual instruments unless I'm trying to make them louder. And what I mean by that is using a limiter as a maximizer, basically. So with this limiter here within Maschine, which is why I'm using Maschine, because I had somebody ask me about Maschine, so I figured I'd use it as an example. So if I was to use the limiter, I would generally say, for example, this 808. You've got the 808 instrument there that it's quite, I guess, dynamic in the sense of it's loud dynamic, but it's not dynamic in the sense of instrument played dynamic. If you can see here, all of the levels are exactly the same, so that's pretty much telling you that the level of the instrument's all at one level. The only thing that is, I guess, dynamic is how loud the first part is and how quiet it finally goes. So if you're looking at the 808, which is what we're looking at, say I go to this limiter here and I pull this down to -10, it's going to increase the volume of that, and as you saw on that first diagram that I had up originally, this one here, oh, not that one, so this one here, you can see what happens basically to a signal that's been limited. So basically this is the original signal, it just goes along as it is, and then when the limited signal is all of the same level, pretty much all throughout the entire signal. So when you're using a limiter, there's one of two things that can happen. You can either use the limiter to create a volume increase in the signal, which brings up the volume to the ceiling height, so this is a ceiling, or you can use a ceiling to control the dynamics of that signal without using the threshold. So a ceiling, basically, if you think of a ceiling as a place where the volume cannot go past. So the ceiling is basically a level. I'll just show you again on that diagram. So a level of signal where this is a ceiling and it hasn't passed that level due to the fact that that's the ceiling. That's the audio ceiling that limiter has created. So if you're going to use a limiter, which is what I tend to use a limiter for most of the times on buses, is if I have drums, for example, and my drum kit, say for example the snare is a little bit louder than my kick, or my kick's a little bit louder than the snare, what I would generally do anyway is put on the group bus, just put a limiter on there, get a limiter, not a compressor, a limiter, get the limiter on there, and set the limiter ceiling to the ceiling that you want. So just play the signal. Okay, so basically you can see that the drums are going there. So if I put the level down there and increase the threshold, it's basically decreasing the dynamic range of those instruments altogether, because it's basically leveling out or maximizing the volume in that regard. So that's one way you could use a limiter in your mix to get the mix right, or the levels right, or controlled. The main thing is to control the peaks of any transient, really. So if your transients are coming through in your mix and you feel like, you know, your instruments are really nice and all of a sudden this kick just comes out of nowhere, that's a good way to control certain stuff like that if you're using a limiter, because basically you're just controlling the peaks. So it's like having all of these go along here and then all of a sudden, bam, this big sound comes out of nowhere, and there's all the quiet sounds after it. So that's basically what a limiter would do. It just controls the level or the volume, so everything is even, pretty much, as you can see in that bottom section there. So hopefully this was helpful for you guys to understand when to use a limiter over a compressor. I'll just quickly explain to you with a compressor. The other thing I want to show you, just so you have a visual of what I'm talking about, is compressors usually, where's my bass? There we go. Okay. So I'll just scroll back to this envelope thing here. So this is the amp envelope, and this is what controls the way that this sustain holds. So if you think of a compressor in the same kind of way, a compressor will have an attack. So say for example the attack is 19 milliseconds and the release is 239. This distance here, and I'll just zoom in there, this distance here is how long the compressor is going to hold that level until it releases it. So basically the attack's here. So this transient, this gap here where the transient is, say for example the transient look like this. This gap basically is allowing this part to come through, and then what's left over, the sustain here, is held by the compressor and then released at a certain point. So that's basically how it works with the compressor. So you're using a limiter to obviously just control the volume and make the dynamic range be level with each other. You can also do the same thing with a compressor, but when you're using a compressor, usually the attack isn't 0 milliseconds. Most times, if it is 0 and it's an extremely fast attack, then generally it will take out all of the attack on that actual instrument and leave not much left for sound-wise. So I hope you guys kind of enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you understood how I choose to use limiters over compressors and why I would use a compressor over a limiter per se, and also just in general about audio. So otherwise, I'll catch you guys on the next one, and love you guys and peace.
Hey yo, hey yo, hey yo, hey yo. Cross Beats Production.